The room was quiet, though it shouldn't have been. 3 men, each trained and hardened in full-contact fighting, stood across from him. The air carried a tension that had no words, just the expectation of conflict. And yet, when it ended, it did so not with noise, but with silence. In 12 seconds, all 3 men were disarmed, unbalanced, and still. They moved no more than necessary, and he had not spoken, not shouted, not gestured. Witnesses would later describe it as inevitability itself, an outcome that seemed written long before the first step was taken. The building itself was unremarkable from the street. A narrow, gray facade, flaking paint, and a faint hum of the city beyond the walls. Inside, the room was low-ceilinged, almost claustrophobic, but organized with care. Wooden floors, scuffed from years of practice, reflected the dim overhead light. Heavy bags swayed slightly in the corners, their leather worn and softened by repeated strikes. A few mats had been laid in a square near the center, marking where training often took place. Along the edges, small groups of local fighters leaned against the walls, their posture casual but alert. No one spoke loudly. Conversations were minimal, a quiet murmur, as if the room itself demanded focus. Observers noted the contrast. The usual laughter, the banter common in gyms, was absent. Even the city outside seemed distant, muffled, irrelevant. A sense of anticipation had begun to settle. Not the raw energy of a crowd, but a patient, watchful tension. The fighters moved through warm-ups slowly, their motions precise, deliberate, each strike practiced, each block methodical. And yet, beneath these ordinary preparations, there was something different. A subtle shift in the air, almost imperceptible, that suggested the usual rhythm of training would soon be disrupted. In the corners, a few older students watched quietly, eyes tracing every movement. One remarked later that it felt as if the room itself had paused, holding its breath. Even the scent of the space, leather, sweat, and polish, seemed heavier, sharper, as if carrying a premonition. No one knew exactly what would happen, only that they were about to witness something unlike any ordinary session. The room was ready, not for spectacle, not for drama, but for clarity. And in that clarity, everything that would follow, the challenge, the demonstration, the inevitable outcome, would unfold without warning, without excess, and with a silence that would linger far longer than the 12 seconds themselves. The door opened with a quiet creak, drawing the eye of every person in the room. Bruce Lee stepped inside, not hurriedly, not theatrically, but with a deliberate, measured pace. His posture was upright but relaxed, movements minimal yet precise. Every step conveyed awareness of the space, of the people, of the unspoken rules that governed the room. The 3 full-contact fighters were already positioned near the mats, their confidence visible in broad shoulders and steady stances. They had faced skilled opponents before, but something in the way Bruce moved, controlled, economical, unassuming, drew their attention in a manner unfamiliar. It was not challenge or bravado that he projected, but presence. Authority without assertion. For a moment no one spoke. The challengers exchanged subtle glances, registering the difference between the man who had entered and the men who had been expecting an ordinary spar. Observers later recalled a pause so profound it felt like time had contracted, an imperceptible stillness that made every heartbeat audible. Bruce surveyed the room slowly, eyes tracing the 3 fighters. There was no flash of aggression, no hint of mockery, no pretense. Every small adjustment, shifting weight, a slight repositioning of his hands, was functional, deliberate, and minimal. Yet each movement carried information, subtle yet undeniable. He understood space, timing, and human reaction at a level beyond ordinary skill. The challengers shifted in response, testing the air, probing, as fighters instinctively do when sensing unfamiliar authority. Their movements were larger, more obvious, but each was met by calm observation rather than immediate action. Bruce did not speak. He did not raise his hands. He simply existed within the center of the room, and in that existence the balance of anticipation began to tilt. Witnesses later described it as a quiet assertion, one that required no words, no demonstration, no intimidation. Presence alone had conveyed mastery, and in the measured pause before the first motion, it became clear that this was not going to be a conventional encounter. What would follow was inevitable, and the room, now attentive in a way that was both physical and psychological, felt the weight of that inevitability. The room seemed to contract around the three fighters and Bruce Lee. Every movement, however small, was amplified in the quiet. Observers noticed that even breathing became noticeable, slower, deliberate, careful. The usual rhythm of training had dissolved into something else entirely. Anticipation layered over control. The challengers began subtle shifts in stance, adjusting weight, tapping fists lightly against palms. Each movement was a test, a probe for weakness, for hesitation. Bruce, however, remained measured. There was no reaction beyond a calm adjustment of posture, almost imperceptible, yet enough to communicate readiness. Witnesses would later note that in those moments, the balance of power was already shifting, quietly but unmistakably. The onlookers instinctively leaned forward, drawn into the stillness. Conversations had ceased entirely. Even the distant hum of the street seemed irrelevant, replaced by the tension in the room that was neither loud nor chaotic. The three fighters moved around Bruce in slow circles, attempting psychological probing, glances, feints, subtle shifts of energy, but he did not engage or respond beyond minimal physical adjustments. Time stretched. 12 seconds, observers would later estimate, could have lasted a minute in the subjective weight of the room. Every subtle movement of the challengers carried information. Every minimal gesture from Bruce conveyed observation and control. His presence created an invisible field, a quiet pressure that made the challengers second-guess themselves, hesitate, reconsider. By the end of the build-up, a quiet consensus had formed in the room. This was not a standard sparring match. The fighters had trained for confrontation, but they had not accounted for this kind of authority, a silent mastery that destabilized without striking. The audience, too, was caught in the tension, recognizing that what was about to happen would be both swift and decisive, but not in the way they had imagined. In that suspended moment, the inevitability hinted at in the opening seconds became tangible. No words had been exchanged. No challenge had been openly declared. Yet the balance was clear. The confrontation, when it came, would not favor those who relied solely on force or expectation. The first movement was almost imperceptible. A shift of weight, a slight pivot of the foot, so subtle that only the closest observers noticed. The three challengers reacted instantly, but not quickly enough. In 12 seconds, each was neutralized, not through forceful aggression, but through precision, timing, and complete control of space. Bruce's motions were economical. One hand guided an opponent's balance. A small adjustment of his own center caused a cascade of misalignment. A second fighter leaned in, anticipating a strike, only to find himself off balance, his own momentum working against him. The third moved to intervene, but Bruce's subtle positioning left no opening. Every step, every slight motion, conveyed mastery of leverage and human reaction. There were no dramatic strikes, no exaggerated gestures. Each movement was deliberate, almost understated. A lift of a shoulder, a tap at an angle, a minimal redirection of force, these were enough. The room's observers would later describe the moment as inevitable, a demonstration of control that transcended brute strength. As the 12 seconds passed, the three fighters were aligned, unbalanced, subdued in presence if not physically injured. Their faces registered disbelief more than pain. Their bodies, trained for resistance, were now controlled by the quiet authority of one man who had moved only as necessary. The psychological effect was immediate. Confidence faltered, hesitation spread. Even without words, the room recognized that skill, when perfected, could render conventional strength irrelevant. Bruce did not speak. He did not gesture beyond what was strictly required. His presence alone had dictated the outcome. Observers later emphasized the subtlety of the demonstration. There was no triumphalism, no expression of superiority beyond calm efficiency. Yet the lesson was clear. Mastery is not about overpowering an opponent. It is about understanding, predicting, and controlling the space in which conflict occurs. And in this moment, mastery had spoken more loudly than any shout could. The room remained silent after the 12 seconds ended. The three fighters stood, their postures slackening, not from physical pain, but from the subtle collapse of certainty. They were trained to anticipate force, to respond to aggression, but this had not been aggression. It was control, minimal yet absolute. Their confidence, once steady and assertive, now wavered under the quiet authority that had guided every movement. Witnesses described the moment as almost imperceptible at first. A slight drop of the shoulders, a hesitant shift of the eyes, a pause in the rhythm of breathing. The challengers were not defeated by strikes or blows, but by the awareness that resistance in that controlled space had been rendered futile. The realization was disorienting. It was quiet, yet profound. Bruce Lee made no gestures of victory. He returned to a neutral stance, composed, observing, as if the encounter were routine rather than extraordinary. There was no elation, no expression of dominance beyond the precision already displayed. The room itself seemed to absorb the lesson silently, the observers, the fighters, and even the walls, bearing witness to the demonstration. One of the challengers later recounted that they had expected confrontation, not this quiet inevitability. Another said that in those seconds, he felt a clarity he could not name, a recognition of skill, presence, and understanding far beyond his own. The third noted that the experience would linger in his memory, shaping how he perceived combat, authority, and control from that day forward. By the time conversation resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension remained, but it was tempered by comprehension. The demonstration had not been violent, yet it had rewritten expectations. The audience grasped that mastery was more than physical skill. It was presence, perception, and the subtle orchestration of space and timing. In that room, in those moments following the encounter, the silent lesson took root. Words were unnecessary. Observation alone carried the weight of understanding, and the realization was shared universally. What had occurred was not merely a display of ability, but a quiet revelation of mastery itself. Years later, the story persisted, not as gossip, not as exaggeration, but as measured recollection. Those who had been present recounted the event in the same way they had experienced it. Quietly, deliberately, with attention to detail rather than embellishment. The 12 seconds had ended decades earlier, yet its effects endured, shaping perceptions of skill, presence, and authority. The three fighters went on with their lives, yet each carried a subtle, lasting shift in understanding. They trained differently, observed more carefully, and considered control and precision over brute force. For them, the lesson was never stated aloud. It was lived, internalized, and referenced silently in subsequent encounters. Bruce Lee's reputation was, in part, defined by moments like this, brief, controlled, and transformative. He did not need to demonstrate superiority repeatedly. One act, executed with mastery, was sufficient to alter perception permanently. Observers often remarked on the simplicity of the demonstration. There had been no theatrics, no shouting, no public spectacle. Yet the impact was undeniable. The encounter became part of the quiet mythology surrounding him, retold in measured tones to students, martial artists, and witnesses alike. Its significance was not in defeat inflicted, but in authority conveyed, a subtle assertion that true mastery could reshape expectations without overt domination. Even decades later, those who had witnessed it remembered the silence, the inevitability, and the efficiency. They reflected on the power of observation, restraint, and precise action, the qualities that had allowed one man to neutralize 3 trained fighters without excess, without aggression, and without fanfare. The story endured not because of spectacle, but because of its quiet truth. Mastery, presence, and understanding leave traces far longer than force or noise ever could. And in that quiet, lasting presence, Bruce Lee's legacy remained intact, not as a tale of violence, but as a demonstration of authority and control, a benchmark against which all others would quietly measure themselves.